it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?
Hello there again, this is Gregory here, and this is Bob Dylan, a head full of ideas, and we're now on to season 4, believe it or not, and today we're going to be looking at Ballad of Frankie Lee and Judas Priest, and this little diatribe is called Nothing is Revealed. The Ballad of Frankie Lee and Judas Priest from 1967's John Wesley Harding is perhaps Bob Dylan's most enigmatic song. And that's really saying something, of course. Over 11 verses and a virtually unchanging musical template, it tells a somewhat convoluted, comical, shaggy dog story about the consequences of falling into too much temptation, complete with mysterious, quasi-religious overtones. The song uses traditional ballad form with no bridges or choruses and sticks to a rigid A-B, A-B, C-D, E-D format with lines 5 and 7 being non-rhyming. The use of the repetitive musical structure keeps the listener focused on the words. Bass and drums, played by stalwart Nashville studio musicians Charlie McCoy and Kenny Buttery, chug along unobtrusively in the background. The overall sound is clear and open, with Dylan relating the story calmly in an almost spoken narrative voice, emphasising the ironies that lie under the surface of the strange series of events that unfold. The use of spoken word records the moralistic and often religious homilies that Hank Williams, Bob Dylan's first hero, as he once called him, recorded in the early 1950s as Luke the Drifter. And do check those out. You'll find those on YouTube somewhere. They're interesting and quite funny, I guess, in an unintentional way. Anyway, much has been written about the deliberate parallels that Dylan draws between the characters in the song and various religious figures. Some commentators seem to treat the ballad as if it is a serious religious allegory, meticulously attempting to force every detail to work as part of an overall moral treatise. But such approaches unfortunately appear to ignore the obvious fact that in terms of the lyrics and Dylan's deadpan delivery, Frankie Lee is first and foremost a humorous discourse, which, although it plays with religious and philosophical ideas, is mostly concerned with satirizing moralistic notions. There is also a sense in which Dylan is playing a game with his audience, inviting them to read significance into the incongruous events that he recounts, and then mocking them for doing so. He's taking the piss, isn't he? Yes. The story, as he often is, the story that the ballad recounts concerns a naive ingenue, Frankie Lee, who borrows money from his friend Judas Priest. After Judas departs, a passing stranger informs him that his friend is calling him from down the road where he is stranded in a house. Frankie finds the house, which turns out to be a brothel. Losing all self-control, he embarks on a mad spree for 16 days and nights before emerging. He crashes into the waiting Judas's arms, but then, without any real explanation, suddenly dies of thirst. That's certainly a shaggy dog story, isn't it? Given that John Wesley Harding quite deliberately presents itself as a mock austere reaction against the excesses of rock culture and psychedelia, it is possible to read the song as an allegory of how Dylan and other rock stars plunged into overindulgence in the mid-1960s. But the song also has wider implications, despite Dylan's tongue-in-cheek stance. Many of those who bought the album searched for the apparent links between the ballad and Dylan's eccentric sleeve notes, a bizarre story centering around a character known as Frank, his wife Vera, his friend Terry Shute, and the 3 kings who come to visit him. All 3 kings have problems. One has a broken nose, another a broken arm, while the third has no money. They appear to be searching for a key to Mr. Dylan's new record. One states that faith is the key, another declares froth is the key, but the third king insists that the key is Frank himself. Frank does not deny this. I mean, would you? But his explanation consists of the following. First of all, he sat down and crossed his legs, and then he sprung up, ripped off his shirt, and began waving it in the air. A light bulb fell from one of his pockets, and he stamped it out with his foot. Then he took a deep breath, moaned, and punched his fist through a plate glass window. As you do, of course. Settling back in his chair, he pulled out a knife. Far enough? He asked. This appears to be enough explanation for the kings, who are now cured of their various malaises. Whether Frank and Frankie Lee are the same person is unclear, but the fact that Frank has, like Jesus, been visited by 3 kings suggests that he has, or they believe he has, some kind of magical healing powers. He is indeed the key to the mysteries of the songs on the album. Yet, of course, his rather mad physical actions provide no real explanation at all. Well, I don't know what you make of those sleeve notes, but it seems to be that Dylan is taking a sly dig here at those fans, listeners or commentators who have claimed to have found the key to his own songs by merely throwing some nonsense at them. In the recently composed recordings that later became known as the basement tapes, Dylan had experimented with a number of nonsense songs. Please Mrs. Henry, The Mighty Quinn, Nothing Was Delivered. These are discussed in another podcast. In Frankie Lee and Judas Priest, he creates an entirely nonsensical scenario which he leavens with various aspects of biblical symbolism. That's just to get us going, I guess. Frankie himself is the kind of Jesus figure, it seems, who Judas Priest, arguably taking on the satanic role, leads into temptation. But instead of suffering in a desert and having to live off locusts, he kills himself through extreme sexual indulgence. If you've got to go, as they say, perhaps. This is, of course, hardly Jesus-like behaviour, however. Judas Priest, despite his name, cannot really be called satanic. If anything, he is mainly being helpful. But the obvious parallels with these well-known mythical figures are tantalising, suggesting that Dylan is deliberately allowing his audience to construct various scenarios which appear to have some religious significance, but then he brings them back down to earth. This is a song with few poetic images, but much snappy dialogue and witty rhyming. We begin with the jaunty Frankie Lee and Judas Priest. They were the best of friends. So when Frankie Lee needed money one day, Judas quickly pulled out a roll of tens. Rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? This establishes the jocular mood, which will be maintained throughout. Frankie is generally considered to be a slightly mocking form of Frank or Francis. Judas Priest is an obvious amalgam of the name of Jesus' betrayer, name checked by Dylan in With God and Our Side, and with that of a religious official. Of course, it was also later on the name of a British heavy metal band. Anyway, the name suggests corruption, but as Judas's role in the song will be mainly that of a beneficiary to Frankie, the naming may well be one of the ironic jokes that pepper the whole thing. It is then said that Judas places the money on a footstool above the plodded plain. That's Plain, by the way. The obscure phrase plotted plain actually refers to an area of land that has been divided into individual plots. This may be a tongue-in-cheek reference to the patriotic anthem America the Beautiful, which includes the phrase fruited plain. Judas cheerfully invites Frankie to take your pick, Frankie boy, my loss will be your gain. At first, Frankie struggles over whether to accept the offer. We are told that with the cold eyes of Judas on him, his head began to spin. Frankie seems particularly self-conscious. Can you please not stare at me like that? He asked Judas. It's just my foolish pride. But sometimes a man must be alone. And this is no place to hide. It does roll off your tongue, doesn't it? Anyway, it seems strange that Frankie is prevaricating now as he asked to borrow money in the first place. The second statement is even more puzzling, suggesting that Frankie is wrestling with some deep personal problem, but this will remain unexplained. Judas winks at him and departs, leaving it up to him as to whether he will accept the money. You better choose which of those bills you want before they all disappear, he says. Frankie assures him that he will take the money. What follows is perhaps the song's most bizarre moment. Just tell me where you'll be. He says, Judas pointed down the road and said, eternity, which is later qualified as, but you might call it paradise. So we then get a knowing smile as Frankie says, I don't call it anything. Seems the pair have a mutual secret here, which they are discussing in ironically knowing terms. Dylan then throws several enigmatic clues at us which hint at some kind of religious significance. Judas has not departed for long before a passing stranger is said to burst upon the scene. We now learn that Frankie Lee is a gambler whose father is deceased. The gambling clearly explains Frankie's lack of money, but the relevance of the paternal demise remains rather mysterious. When the passing stranger informs Frankie that Judas is stranded in a house, Frankie flies into a panic. He dashes off to meet him, inquiring, "What kind of house is this, where I have come to roam?" Judas's equally enigmatic reply is, "It's not a house, it's a home." This response seems to have a considerable effect on Frankie. He is said to tremble and lose all self-control over everything that he had made while the mission bells did toll. A number of questions now hang in the air. Is Judas suggesting that Frankie has finally come home? Is the house some kind of house of worship? What might we make of the statement about everything that Frankie has made? Is Frankie therefore some kind of Jesus figure? Is Judas really tempting as the devil, Frankie? And why are the mission bells tolling? These floating enigmas, as we might call them, it's a phrase I've just made up, I think, all seem to suggest that the song is some kind of parable. Perhaps we may expect that Frankie will now have some kind of spiritual revelation. His reaction when he looks at the house is certainly one of awe. He just stood there staring at that big house as bright as any sun, with 24 windows. We may think at first that this is some kind of church or temple, until Dylan delivers the line, "with a woman's face in every one." Thus, this much vaulted home is in fact a brothel, and a rather spectacular one at that. Frankie is now overcome by a gargantuan lust. His adventures within are crammed into one remarkable verse which begins, "Well, up the stairs ran Frankie Lee with a soulful bounding leap, and foaming at the mouth he began to make his midnight creep." A midnight creep is a phrase that can be found in many blues songs describing such sexual adventurism. We hear that for 16 nights and days he raved, and on the 17th he burst into the arms of Judas Priest, which is where he died of thirst. Dylan covers a spectacular amount of ground in these few lines. By now it's surely become obvious that the song is in fact a kind of parody of the biblical story. Instead of spending 40 days and nights in the desert, leading to the most ascetic life possible, Frankie spends 16 days and nights indulging his carnal lusts to a ludicrous extent. In John 19:28, Jesus, in pain upon the cross, famously cries, "I thirst." In Frankie's case, the thirst extinguishes him. In the famous penultimate verse, Dylan wags a cautionary finger at those who would read too much significance into the story. He begins, "No one tried to say a thing when they carried him out in jest." The presence of the phrase "in jest" may possibly suggest that Frankie is not really dead at all, and that reports of him dying of thirst were merely a comic exaggeration, describing a man whose lust has been so satiated. Then we meet the final character in the song, described only as the little neighbour boy who carried him to rest, who walks alone along with his guilt so well concealed. We never learn why the neighbour boy should be feeling guilty. Some commentators have speculated that he and the passing stranger are in fact the same person. There's no real evidence in the text for this. The song is full of such unexplained enigmas. Remember those floating enigmas? Watch out for them, they're everywhere. And if we haven't yet grasped that the whole song is indeed a parody, we hear that the neighbour boy muttered underneath his breath, "Nothing is revealed." Having tantalised us with 10 verses which appear to have some spiritual significance, this time Dylan's surely telling us the joke is on us. Ha ha! Or is he? Has he really recast the temptations of Christ as a country and western song featuring gamblers and prostitutes? And what does "nothing is revealed" actually signify? Can we link the mention of nothing to the way he meditates on the word in several recently composed songs from the Basement tapes, such as "Nothing Was Delivered" or "Too Much of Nothing"? In these songs, nothing becomes, ironically, a thing in itself, signifying an absence of any underlying principle or logic behind the machinations of the world. As King Lear, a considerable influence on the basement tape song Tears of Rage, states in his confusion at his daughter's refusal to declare how much she loves him, nothing will come of nothing. Lear's world is a godless, purposeless void, the same void perhaps that the neighbour boy has identified. The final verse is delivered in the style of a Luke the Drifter tile homily, in which the narrator traditionally delivers a moral lesson to the audience. But instead of suggesting some spiritual truth, the advice given is merely simple and practical. The moral of this story, the moral of this song, is simply that one should not be where one does not belong. Well, you can't argue with that, can you, really? Then there is another reference to neighbourliness. And if you see your neighbour carrying something, help him with his load. Despite all the religious symbolism that is hinted at and often parodied in the song, the important spiritual task here is merely to be helpful to one's fellow human beings. But Dylan has one final admonitory twist to deliver, and don't go mistaking paradise for that home across the road. The serious point here seems to be that excessive hedonism is not in itself a route to happiness, spiritual contentment, or salvation. The Ballad of Frankie and Judas Priest is certainly one of Bob Dylan's most effective comic songs, even if some of its conclusions may be serious ones. In many ways, it is an object lesson in Dylan's use of ambiguity. It can be seen as a deliberate parody, not only of religious symbolism, but also of those fans who exalted Dylan to the status of a prophet, frequently misinterpreting his lyrics in terms of their spiritual significance. Many of these fans, who included the crazed Dylanologist A.J. Weberman, a very notorious man, whose analyses of Dylan's lyrics spilled over into disturbing paranoia, and that's an understatement actually, seem to think that Dylan should be some kind of political leader of the movement, and that his lyrics were written in some kind of secret code within which were instructions to his followers to how to start the revolution. Blimey. Many years later, in Chronicles Volume 1, Dylan would make clear how much he despised those who tried to place him in such a role. And this is what he says in Chronicles. I was sick of the way my lyrics had been extrapolated, their meaning subverted into polemics, and that I'd been anointed the big bubber of rebellion, the high priest of protest, the czar of dissent, the duke of disobedience, leader of the freeloaders, Kaiser of apostasy, Archbishop of anarchy, the big cheese. Yes, I guess he could have gone on. Anyway, in Frankie Lee and Judas Priest, Dylan strings such followers along, placing plenty of clues in front of them, and then deliberately leaving them unexplained. They will, of course, be hoping for a final revelation in the song. When it's finally delivered by the little neighbour boy, however, it strongly suggested that all these clues were just meaningless. Nothing, indeed, is revealed. Yet in that very anti-revelation itself, there's a kind of cry for the poet within Dylan to be released from the pressures of over-expectation and over-veneration, which were clearly driving him to distraction. So much so, in fact, that he was now about to retreat from the public eye for 7 years, during which he was only to play one major concert and present his public with songs that could decidedly not be over-interpreted. Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope we've made a bit of sense of that. You can read a lot of reviews and people trying to explain this song online. I've looked at a lot of them, and people really do take it a little bit too seriously. Anyway, that's enough for now, and I shall see you next time. Bye.
Is it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?